Avatar's coming to Magic in November, but today we got a super early sneak peek at the set, including what all the bending mechanics do and some pretty spicy cards, which means we've got some spoilers to discuss. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for our first daily dose of Avatar The Last Airbender spoilers. So Avatar, it's a Universes Beyond set that's dropping on November 21st, so we still have, oh my god, September, October, November, like 3 months, over 3 months to go. We still gotta get through Spider-Man, which we haven't even really officially started spoiler season yet, but today we got a super early sneak peek at the set, and some of these cards are pretty wild. The new mechanics are super cool. Allies are coming back. Lessons are coming back. We have so much to discuss, which means we should probably start breaking down some new cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Avatar The Last Airbender. So a couple of weeks ago at San Diego Comic-Con, Wizards previewed just a couple of cards from the Avatar set, and one of them was Avatar Aang, and Avatar Aang references 4 different mechanics: Firebend, Waterbend, Earthbend, and Airbend. But we didn't know what any of those mechanics actually did, but today Wizards revealed all of these mechanics. So let's break down the new mechanics from the Avatar set, starting with Waterbend. So we got 2 new Waterbend cards: Katira, Water Tribe's Hope, and Aang's Iceberg. So let's start with Katira, a 5-mana 3/3 with Vigilance. It's a legendary human warrior ally. Interesting to see allies coming back, although these aren't really like old school allies. Old school allies, they all work together. When you played one ally, they'd all help each other, kind of like slivers, more or less. These allies are pretty much just for flavor because I guess they're friends and they all kind of get along, but it will synergize loosely with old allies. But Katira, a 5-mana 3/3 legend with Vigilance. When it enters, you make a 1/1 white ally creature token, and then it has Waterbend X and says creatures you control have base power toughness of XX until end of turn. X can't be 0, activate only during your turn. So what is Waterbend? Waterbend means you can pay the cost of a Waterbend effect by tapping artifacts and creatures to help, with each one reducing the cost by 1. So essentially, it's Convoke or it's Improvise, but it lets you tap either artifacts or creatures. So far, we've only seen Waterbend on abilities, so I don't know if we're going to have cards that we actually cast with a Waterbend cost. Maybe, but it looks like it's mostly on abilities. Aang's Iceberg, we'll talk more about that one in a minute. A 3-mana flash enchantment. When it enters, you exile up to 1 target non-land permanent until it leaves the battlefield. Waterbend of 3, sack it to scry 2. So let's talk about Katira. So Katira, it reminds me a lot of Mirror Entity, kind of a 5-mana Mirror Entity, but sort of the same ability, right? Where you pay X mana, you turn all your creatures into base power and toughness of XX, which means if you have a lot of mana, you can just make your team super duper huge. And the fact that it has Waterbend makes it kind of better in some ways than Mirror Entity. Like, maybe not from a competitive perspective, because Mirror Entity is only 3 mana, Katira's 5 mana, but the ability itself is way better because you can tap random artifacts you have laying around, random creatures. It might be summoning sicker you don't need to help power up the Waterbend cost. It is interesting that they put the X can't be 0 on there. One of the tricks with Mirror Entity is you can just pay 0 to kill your entire board if you wanted like a weird mass sack outlet. Can't do that with Katira, but still, seems like a pretty powerful effect. I think the easiest way to take advantage of Waterbend, there's really 2 paths. The one is you can go hard on artifact tokens, creatures that make artifact tokens like Spider Ham, Peter Porker, Spyglass Siren, Alquist Prof, Goldvein Hydra. Any of these cards are really good with Katira, because if you can just make a bunch of maps or clues or treasures or foods, you can tap all those to pump your creatures, which seems like a pretty powerful effect. The other direction to go is just make a bunch of tokens. And this is where it gets a little weird, because if you're using Katira's Waterbend to pump all your creatures, you don't really want to tap your creatures because you want to attack with them, presumably. But if you go super wide with whatever, Frontline Rush, form a posse, make a ton of creatures, then you can just dump all your mana into Katira, pump everything super huge, probably win the game with 1 super big attack. So I think this card at 5 mana, probably a little bit too much to really be a competitive standard card, but I could imagine a world where this was a finisher, right? Where you just build up a big board of stuff, drop this, the same turn that you drop it, tap a bunch of stuff, pay the rest of your mana, pump your team, hopefully kill your opponent with 1 big attack. So I think this is probably mostly like a commander card, but I could see trying to build around it in standard too. As far as Aang's Iceberg, this one's pretty easy. Aang's Iceberg is literally Oblivion Ring that is just super duper power crept, which is probably a good thing because Oblivion Rings don't really see play anymore, these enchantment exile based removal effects, but getting an Oblivion Ring that has flash is a super huge deal. At first, when I read this card, I was like, why would I want to sack my Oblivion Ring? That's kind of counterintuitive. Is it like my opponent goes to kill it and I sack it in response? I'm like, haha, you get your thing back, but I scry too. That doesn't seem very good. But the actual trick here is this is supposed to be kind of like Werefox Bodyguard, where along with being a removal spell, it's also like a weird protection or blink spell for your own creature, where if your opponent goes to kill your thing, you flash this in, you exile your own creature, and then you can always pay 3, which is actually probably going to be 0 a lot of the time because you can just tap random stuff to Waterbend to get your thing back when you want it. So I actually kind of like this card. I think that flash is a super huge deal. I'm not sure that it completely solves the problem that keeps Oblivion Ring effects from seeing a lot of play, but in a standard where there's stuff like Tifa Lockhart, there's VV Ornithir, you really need to be able to answer stuff at instant speed, because if your opponent just like Tifas and you can't deal with it, you're probably going to die. Same with VV. So I feel like that is a big deal. Like being able to flash this in is super huge. Although a big part of the problem with Oblivion Ring style removal is it's temporary removal, right? Your opponent can into the Flood Maw and bounce it and get their thing back, or get lost it and get their thing back. And those are really popular cards in standard. So I'm not sure that this upgrade is enough to turn Aang's Iceberg into like a standard staple, but in some sort of blink deck, maybe with some of the warp things, you can warp it and then exile to Aang's Iceberg and then Waterbend to get the thing back. There are some cool synergies for the card. So Aang's Iceberg, one of the best Oblivion Rings, probably the best Oblivion Ring that we've ever gotten. Is it enough to make an Oblivion Ring playable in 2025? That is still another question. Moving on to our next mechanic, we have Firebending, as we see on Fire Lord Zuko, and I gotta say, the showcase treatment on that card looks super cool. I don't even really know Avatar, so it's not like I have some connection to this art, but just the treatment looks so neat. It is textless, which might annoy some people, but it is a really, really cool looking magic card. But Fire Lord Zuko, a 3-mana Mardu 2/4, legendary human noble ally. Told you everything's an ally in this set, apparently. It is Firebending X, where X is its power. So what does Firebending mean? Firebending means whenever the creature attacks, you add X red mana, and the mana lasts until the end of combat. So mana production, but only mana production that can be used at instant speed, because it's going to run out when you go to your second main phase. And then it says when you cast a spell from exile, or whenever a permanent you control enters from exile, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. And that ability is actually very, very scary. So Fire Lord Zuko kind of reminds me of Zurgo, actually, as the Mardu 2/4, and so far Zurgo hasn't really taken off, so we'll have to see. Being in 3 colors is kind of annoying and an issue in standard, and I think in a vacuum, I think that like Zurgo and Preacher of the Schism might be more powerful than Fire Lord Zurko, like just in a generic deck. Fire Lord Zurko, I think the real power of this card isn't so much Firebending, which is nice, but you're going to have to do a little bit of work to really take advantage of it. But it's really the Prosper text, the payoff for playing things from exile. That's the part of the card that's actually super scary, because if you build around that effect, it is going to make your team really, really big, really, really quickly. So what do we actually do with Firebending? As I mentioned before, it's a powerful effect, right? This 3-drop attacks and you get 2 extra mana, and if you pump its power, could be even more extra mana, but you have to use that mana at instant speed during combat. So what do we actually do with this mana? So the easiest answer is instants, although it's worth mentioning that Wizards seems to have kind of designed the Avatar set to account for this. We got, for example, we didn't get a ton of cards from the set, but we did get one from Avatar Eternal, which is like the Jumpstart adjacent product that's not technically standard legal, so don't get too excited about Firelord Oze, but still, it works really well with it, and it has an ability that you can activate at any time, right? Pay 6, exile the top card of each opponent's library until the end of turn. You play one of those cards for free. So stuff like that works really well with the Firebending mechanic. So I think that's kind of the idea here. If you're going to play Firebending and just like jam Firelord Zurko in a normal deck, you're not going to get much value out of the ability. But if you build around it and you play stuff with activated abilities that you can use at instant speed, instants that you can cast, like Great Train Heist or a Braid or Dreadmaw, or then it actually becomes a really, really strong mechanic. So it's going to be interesting to see how people try to harness the power of Firebending. I will say, the last mode on this card, as I mentioned before, that's the part that is absolutely frightening. That whenever you cast a spell from exile or a permanent enters from exile, put a +1/+1 counter, not on a creature, but each creature you control, that can get out of hand really, really quickly. So in standard, we have like Opera Love Song. Impulse draws 2 cards, they go to exile, you play them, you grow your team. We have stuff like Count on Luck, kind of does the same thing each turn. It works with the warp mechanic, like Nova Hellkite. When you cast it from exile, it'll be a permanent coming into play from exile, so you get counters on stuff. So I think that might be the most interesting way to try to build around this card, is really going on the impulse draw effect. It also, once you get to older formats, probably like Commander, it's kind of like a cool Blink Commander. It really does kind of compare to Prosper. Prosper is even in 2 of these colors, right? So if it's something that works with Prosper, it's also going to work with Firelord Zurko. But then you also get white cards, and the most interesting white cards in a play from exile deck, or things entering from exile effect, are going to be Blink effects, right? Because if you blink a permanent, it's going to be entering from exile, so that's going to trigger Firelord Zurko to put counters on things. So like Ephemerit's really good, Lazelle's Acrobatics. So I actually think Firelord Zurko is a super cool commander. It's like Prosper with interesting blink shenanigans, and it even makes mana when it attacks. The other mechanic that Firelord Zurko works really well with is another new one from Avatar, which is Airbending, which we see on Appa Steadfast Guardian. So Appa is a 4-mana 3/4 Bison ally. It's also a legendary creature. It has flash and flying. It says when it enters, airbend any number of other target non-land permanents you control. What does airbend mean? Airbend means you exile them, and while each one is exiled, its owner can cast it by paying 2 rather than its mana cost. And then it's also mono white Prosper. Whenever you cast a spell from exile, you get to make a 1/1 white allied creature token. So airbending is actually kind of intriguing. I'm not really sure what to think about this mechanic. My first impression was, it's kind of like a really bad Blink. Like, this is kind of like a Restoration Angel, right? Or actually more like a Restoration Angel Abdul Adrian, since you can exile any number of non-land permanents. But the thing is, when you exile those permanents, they don't just come back into play on your end step or right away. You actually have to pay 2 mana to return them to play. So in a lot of ways, my initial reaction to this mechanic was not super positive. It kind of just felt like bad Blink to me. But then the more I thought about it, I realized, okay, it's actually just a build around mechanic. And one of the coolest parts of Appa is it does synergize with itself. If you flash this in, exile a bunch of your stuff, and then you cast that stuff for 2 mana, you're going to make a bunch of ally tokens as you do it, which actually seems kind of powerful. So you can flash this in to save your team. Yeah, you're going to have to spend some mana to redeploy everything, but that's probably fine, especially if you're getting a bunch of ally tokens out of the way as you go. So this is a card, and I think this is a mechanic that you really build around. This is very similar to the other bending mechanics, where if you just jam this in a random deck, you're probably not going to get that much value out of it. But if you build around the effect, it becomes really strong. So how do you build around this? And I think it's other play from exile stuff, like Pia Nilar. When you play something from exile, you make a 1/1 Thopter, and it gives them haste. So if you have Appa, you exile your stuff, you have a Pia down, you play all your stuff from exile for 2 mana, you get a ton of tokens. It's also interesting, and this might be more of like a weird combo plan, but it's interesting with mana rocks that make a ton of mana. So one of the cool things about Appa is you can blink any non-land permanents, or I guess airbend any non-land permanents. But if you airbend like a Thran Dynamo or a Gilded Lotus that tap for 3 mana, or a Throne of Eldraine, which can tap for 4 mana, you can tap them all for mana, Appa to blink them all, recast them all for 2 mana, but they tap for more than 2 mana, so you actually turn them into these weird rituals. So maybe there's some weird sort of loop where you like tap all your mana rocks, Appa, recast all your mana rocks, tap them again to make even more mana, blink Appa, do it again, and like kind of storm off somehow. So that's the most interesting way I've seen so far to actually just straight up break the mechanic. But as I said before, it just works really well with cast from exile stuff. It's good with Firelord Zuko. It's good with Quintarius Khan. So anything like that, I think Appa is going to be very interesting. In Commander, I actually really like this mechanic because I'm a Blink player at heart. If you go back to early days of Commander Clash, I played so many Blink decks, but it's an archetype that I've really moved away from because it just ends up being so loopy and it takes so much time to go through your turns. So I've really moved away from Preston and Abdul Adrian and Bragos. These are all decks that I've had at various points in the past, but I actually think Appa might be a kind of Blink style deck that I would actually enjoy playing, because it's not just going to loop and everything's not just going to immediately come back into play and make a million triggers. It's actually kind of a fun way to play that, where you can play Appa. It's still a Blink effect. You play it, you save your team, you recast this stuff. So I think this might be like a fairer version of Blink. This still has some upside because you get to play from exile synergies. So Appa, I actually really like this card. I think the mechanic, I still think it looks a little bit like bad Blink at first glance, but the more I think about it, there's actually a lot of cool synergies for it, and it seems like it's probably going to be super fun to build around. The last of our bending mechanics might actually be the least exciting, but it comes on one of the most interesting cards we've seen, maybe the most interesting card we've talked about so far, in Toph, the first Metal Bender. So Toph is a 4-mana Naya 3/3 legendary human warrior ally. It says non-token artifacts you control are lands in addition to their other types, which is just an incredibly cool, super unique line of text. Although it does clarify they don't actually gain the ability to tap for mana, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then it has Earthbend 2 on your end step. So what does Earthbend mean? It means target land you control becomes a 0/0 creature with haste. It's still a land. Put 2/1/1 counters on it. When it dies or it's exiled, return it to the battlefield tapped. Obviously, not every Earthbend is going to work this way, because not every Earthbend creature is going to turn all of your non-token artifacts into lands, but Toph in specific lets you turn your artifacts into lands and then turn those into creatures. So it does become this weird, like, roundabout way to turn your artifacts into creatures, and it is nice that it helps protect them, right? Where if your thing that you have animated with Earthbend dies or even goes to exile, you're going to get it back into play. So this card, I imagine, has to be insanely broken somehow. It reminds me of Ashaya, and we've seen with Ashaya, which turns non-token creatures into lands, into forest lands. It's just a ridiculous combo piece where you get the right synergy set up and it just pops off and does this ridiculous stuff. It's never been like a competitive card or anything like that, but it's just a card that can do really, really wild things. And I imagine that Toph is going to be somewhat similar, where if you get the right synergies with this, turning all of your non-token artifacts into lands is just going to do some absolutely hilariously wild things. So Earthbending itself, it's actually very similar to something like Awaken, which was turning lands into creatures by putting counters on them. The twist here is the protection mode, right? Awaken, if your land got dealt with, it just died forever. And it was actually kind of risky because you really don't want to like turn your land into a creature and then have it just got by a removal spell and then it turns it into a stone rain and you're down a land and you probably lose. So it's really risky to just turn your lands into creatures. Earthbending gets around that though by giving that protection. So if your land is dealt with, you're going to get it back. It's tapped, but sure, whatever. The only downside I see is it doesn't account for bounce. So Into the Floodmaw is still pretty good against Earthbend, other bounce effects, but in general, this is a pretty safe way to turn your things into land. Toph, though, I'm trying to figure out what to do with this card. So non-token artifact is a pretty big safety valve. If this turned all of your token artifacts into lands, this would be an absolutely just obscene card. Like, it's already a pretty wild card, but it would be so busted if it didn't say non-token on there. But in standard, maybe some sort of artifact deck where you have like Sir Ginger and Ginger Brew, Agatha Soul Cauldron, Legion Extruder. You play these artifacts, they're going to be lands technically. Maybe you can find a way to make some mana with them. Worst case, you can put counters on them with Earthbend to turn them into creatures. So I think that could be one possibility. It's kind of like, as I mentioned before, like a synthesizer lab ship, because Toph turns your artifacts into lands and then turn lands into creatures. It is like a synthesizer lab ship with extra steps, a way to turn your artifacts into 2/2 creatures. The other thing to do is try to take advantage of your artifacts being lands. So how do we actually do that? So first, you can make them tap for mana is the most obvious thing. So even though Toph turns your artifacts into lands, it doesn't give them a mana ability, but there are cards that give all your lands mana abilities. Like in standard right now, we have Greenhouse, Rickety Gazebo, and Greenhouse just says, lands you control have tap to make a mana of any color. So if you have Toph and a Greenhouse, that means all of your artifacts are lands, and all of your lands tap for mana, so now all of your artifacts actually tap for mana. In older formats like Commander, Chromatic Lantern does the same thing. Probably the best way to do this is actually just Yavimaya or Urborg, which just turns each land into a forest or each land into a swamp. So those are kind of free because they just come in your mana base. So that's going to be really, really strong with Toph. Also worth mentioning in Commander, I know Urborg looks like a black card, but there's technically no black mana symbols on it. So you actually can play it in a Toph deck. It's not breaking color identity. ability. Yeah, it's going to turn all of your lands into swamps, which might not be super helpful color-wise, but just turning all of your artifacts into lands that make mana is still going to be pretty powerful, even if it's making black mana. So keep that in mind for your top decks in Commander. You can also play other effects that just let your lands do things. There's not a ton of these, but like Bootlegger's Slash says your lands have tap to make a treasure token. With Top Out, all of your non-token artifacts will now have tap to make a treasure token because they're lands, which seems like a pretty fun synergy. There's also just ridiculous combo potential with this card. So how do you go infinite with Toph? And the easiest way is to use cards like Liquimetal Torque and Liquimetal Coating, which can turn anything into an artifact, to turn things that shouldn't be artifacts into artifacts. So easy way for infinite mana, something like Liquimetal Torque and Croson Restore. Croson Restore, if you have Threshold, taps to untap up to 3 target lands. So the idea would be use one of the Liquimetal cards to make Croson Restore into an artifact, which because of Toph will mean it's also a land. So now you have a Croson Restore that can tap to untap itself, since it's a land that's also an artifact, and untap 2 other lands. So you just tap your lands, tap the Croson Restore, untap itself, 2 lands, tap your lands again, do it again, make infinite mana, use the infinite mana to win the game. It also can go infinite with things like Ugin's Nexus. Ugin's Nexus is an artifact that says it would be put into the graveyard from the battlefield. Instead, you exile it and take an extra turn after this one. So if you have Ugin's Nexus and a sack outlet like Legion Extruder, just anything that can sack an artifact. So what you can do is go to your end step, use Toph to turn Ugin's Nexus into a creature with its Earthbending ability, and then still on your end step, sacrifice the Ugin's Nexus to the Legion Extruder. Ugin's Nexus can end up going to exile, but it's going to give you an extra turn. But Earthbending says if the thing goes to exile or dies, you return it to play tapped. So when Ugin's Nexus go to exile, it actually is just going to come back into play tapped. And then during your extra turn, you do it again. You go to your end step, turn it into a creature with Earthbending, sack it to whatever Legion Extruder, get another extra turn. So that gives you infinite turns in Naya, which is kind of neat. It's really good with just any artifact that can sack itself, though. Like, this is kind of a Mindslaver lock by itself, assuming you have enough mana. You can go to your end step, turn Mindslaver into a creature with Earthbending, sack Mindslaver to control your opponent's next turn. It's going to be a land with Earthbending that went to the graveyard, so it's going to come back into play tapped. You control your opponent's turn during your next turn, sack Mindslaver again, do the same loop. So there's some pretty cool shenanigans with this card. If you want the just most basic shenanigan, it's cute with fetch lands. Like, you turn on your fetch land with Earthbending, you can sacrifice it to ramp out a land, and you get the fetch land back because of the Earthbending ability. But what I want to do with this card, and this is mostly just for fun because it doesn't even do anything, but with Blood Moon, you can turn all of your non-token artifacts into mountains, which is kind of hilarious because all of your non-token artifacts will be lands, which will count as non-basic lands, but then Blood Moon will turn them into mountains, and then all of a sudden you're in business because you got a bunch of non-token artifacts that can tap to make red mana. So Toph, this card's ridiculous. It's probably my favorite card that they revealed from the set so far. The ability is just so super unique. Earthbend itself, I'm kind of like, whatever. There's some cool shenanigans with it coming back once it dies or goes to exile, but just turning your non-token artifacts into lands is such a unique ability. I cannot wait to build around this card. So moving on from the bending mechanics to the rest of the set, we also got a good one in Redirect Lightning, which shows that lessons are coming back in Avatar, but more on this in a minute. So Redirect Lightning, 1 mana instant lesson. It says, is an additional cost to cast it, pay 5 life for 2 mana, and then change the target of target spell or ability with a single target. So first off, it's really hilarious that lessons are in this set. If you weren't playing when Strixhaven released a few years ago, Learn in Lessons was a mechanic from Strixhaven, and the idea was lesson cards you could put in your sideboard, and when you cast a Learn card, you could tutor one of the lesson cards from your sideboard into your hand, or you could discard a card, draw a card, which is a little bit less powerful than tutoring from your sideboard. But Wizards announced that there's actually no Learn in the Avatar set. It's just lessons. They just thought that lessons were flavorful, so they decided to put lessons in the set, even though there's no Learn. So we're not going to be able to tutor them up from our sideboards in Standard, at least yet, although you can in older formats. But I think this is really probably a plant for the future, because Learn in Lessons came from Strixhaven, and we know we're going back to Strixhaven next spring, so I would not be surprised if all these lesson cards, which right now are basically just weird flavor text, actually become relevant once we go back to Strixhaven, because it's very possible we get more Learn cards then. But Redirect Lightning, it kind of doesn't matter, because I think this card is just pretty good, especially in Commander. even with less than just being flavor text, because this is essentially a deflecting swat or a bolt bend or an untimely malfunction that just costs a single mana. Sure, you gotta pay 5 life, but in Commander you have 40 life, so paying 5 isn't a big deal, especially if this is like protecting a combo, protecting your Voltron commander that's gonna win the game. So yeah, there are some downsides here, but really this is kind of the first 1 mana redirect spell that we've ever gotten, and I think that probably means this card is pretty relevant. So obviously the dream with this card is your opponent goes to like Goblin Charbelcher you or Aetherflux Reservoir you, and you're like, no, I'm gonna switch the targets, that's going back at your face, which sounds really funny, although more likely you're gonna use this to like change the target of a removal spell that's going after your commander. And I was looking at red commanders, and I feel like this fits in a lot of different decks. Like Kalia, you really want to protect your commander. Magda, you want to protect your commander. Krenko, Winota, any deck like that. This is a really powerful effect for a red deck to have access to, because for a single mana, if your opponent tries to mess with your stuff, essentially you get to not only stop it from killing your thing, but throw that removal spell back at one of your opponent's things to get one of their things off the battlefield. So I think this card, especially in higher powered commander decks, is actually going to be a pretty powerful option. I will say it's at its best in non-blue decks, because if you're in blue, you can just play a counter spell and you don't need redirect effects. But in non-blue decks that care about protecting their commander or forcing through a combo, I think this is actually a very, very strong option. So redirect lightning, I think it'll see some commander play. Personally, I'm not a big redirect believer, but like Tomer, he loves redirect effects. He loves Bolt Bend. He plays them in a ton of decks. So if you're someone who's a believer in redirect effects, this is one of the best versions we've got. And I wouldn't even be surprised to see this as a CDH card in the future. I think it's actually that efficient that it could even be CDHable. We also got a couple more allies in Katara the Fearless and Hakoda Selfless Commander. And I put these two cards together because their story is pretty simple. If you're playing a deck with a ton of allies, then these are going to be really good. If you're not playing a ton of allies, then these cards kinda don't do anything. So Katara number 2, a 3-mana Bant 3/3 legendary human warrior ally. It says if a triggered ability on an ally you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. So essentially, Panharmonicon, 4 allies, that's a legend, so you can play it as your commander. Hakoda, 4 mana for a 3/5 with Vigilance. It says you can look at the top card of your library at any time. You may cast ally spells from the top of your library, and then you can sack it to give your creatures +0/+5 and indestructible until end of turn. And the thing I love about these cards is I feel like they perfectly exemplify Wizards' favorite way of designing cards in 2025. Every set, every tribe, every theme gets 2 things now, which is a Panharmonicon effect and a way to play their thing off the top of their library. So they hit all the marks. They got the cookie cutter stuff out of the way. You gotta have the Panharmonicon. You gotta have the play off the top of your deck. But really, in an ally deck, both of these cards are incredibly good. I think arguably Katira might be one of the best ally commanders. We'll have to wait and see what this means for standard. So far, allies have just kind of been randomly tacked onto pretty much everything from the Avatar set. So we're gonna have to dig into all these abilities and figure out if any of them are actually worth Panharmoniconing. But if there is some sort of ally deck in standard, I could see either one of these cards being good enough to be in the deck. They both serve a pretty important purpose and have a pretty powerful effect. I really like, though, how Katara works with older allies. So these new allies from Avatar, they're just kind of normal cards, but back in their original form, allies did one thing, which was whenever an ally entered, it would trigger all your other allies, which is really powerful with an effect like Katara, because that means if you have like a Kazandu Blade Master, which whenever an ally enters, it gets a +1/+1 counter, every ally that you play is going to double trigger. Or Andu Cleric, whenever an ally enters, you gain life equal to the number of allies you control, you are going to gain so much life. Or Halimar Excavator, whenever an ally enters, you mill equal to the number of allies you control. You're going to mill people's libraries super, super quickly. So I'm actually really excited to build a Bant ally deck in Commander based around Katira being the commander and the old allies just all trigger each other, and you're just gonna have so many triggers and it's gonna be super, super fun. So Katira, I really like this card. We'll have to wait and see if they have any impact on standard, but worst case, they seem like really fun commander cards. We also got one that I'm pretty sure is going to be good in standard, which is Sokka Bold Boomeranger. So this is a 2-mana 1/1. When it enters, you discard up to 2 cards and then draw that many cards. And then when you cast an artifact spell or a lesson spell, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So Sokka It's basically patchwork automation that gives up the ward and is in 2 colors and is legendary, so a worse version of patchwork automation, but it gets Tursa Light Shatter's Enters ability, and that's the part of the card that actually has me excited about its standard potential. So yeah, the artifact mode, I guess it's fine. If you're some sort of tough cookie, Ginger Brute, Sir Ginger deck, maybe you play this as a 2-drop that's going to grow throughout the game and does some filtering, but I think the exciting part about this card, and really the scary part about this card, is this gives the double looting, double rummaging ability that we see on Tursa Light Shatter and Kiora in the 2-drop slot, which is something we just don't have access to. We have Charming Scoundrel, which rummages 1, Fear Missing Out rummages 1, but being able to double rummage on a 2-drop actually seems pretty relevant. And it goes into already the best decks in Standard, with VV wanting to be in the graveyard for the Soul Cauldron, Abhorrent Oculus, this gets the Oculus in the graveyard to reanimate it, and it just does this faster than a lot of the other options. So I think this is a card that could show up in some of the best decks in Standard, just because it's such a cheap way to double rummage and get a bunch of cards in your graveyard early in the game. The lesson text, I think it's still mostly just flavor text, although it is kind of cute that you could build a commander deck around it. It is a legend, so maybe we get enough lessons that you play Sokka and just play a whole bunch of legends and try to grow it. Although I will say, if you weren't there for Strixhaven, the original lessons were really underpowered. Wizards knew that we could tutor them from our sideboards, so they just added a bunch of extra mana to them to make them not very efficient. So you'd be playing a lot of not very powerful cards, or at least not very efficient cards, but it's still kind of neat just because we've never had a lessons matter commander before, and this is the first one. So Sokka, I imagine it's going to be good in Standard just for its rummaging ability and maybe some upside in some sort of artifact deck. We also got a new Lemur Bat ally in Momo Friendly Flyer. So a 1-mana 1/1 legendary Lemur Bat ally. It has flying, of course. It says the first non-lemur creature spell with flying that you cast during each of your turns costs 1 less to cast, and whenever another creature you control with flying enters, Momo gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So Momo, it looks like a pretty weird card, but what this essentially is a weird Burning Tree Emissary effect, a free effect if you're playing the right deck. So Burning Tree Emissary is just a 2-drop that makes 2 mana when you play it. So you pay 2, you get back 2. Momo, assuming you're playing a deck with a bunch of flyers and can follow it up with another flyer, is kind of the same thing. You spend 1 mana, but then you get back 1 mana by making your first non-lemur creature spell with flying cost 1 less to cast. And I think this card actually is kind of a big deal for Standard for one specific deck, and that is the Bat deck. So Bats came out in Bloomburrow, and they were kind of played when they first came out, but Bats had one really, really big problem, which is the Bat deck wants to be aggro. That's kind of their gimmick. You get all these flying creatures, you get in for a bunch of damage in the air, but they only had a single 1-drop, and that 1-drop is Ruin Lurker Bat, which isn't even that good of a 1-drop, but there literally is only 1 Bat 1-drop in Standard. Momo being a Bat and being a 1-drop is actually a really, really big deal for the deck, and it actually seems very good in the deck. If you think about how this plays, you could, like, on turn 2 play this, followed up with Deep Cavern Bat. On turn 3, this into Zora line. It's also a Bat, so it triggers all your synergies. And a Bat deck is going to be full of flyers, so even though this is just a 1-mana 1/1, there's a good chance that some turns it's going to be hitting for 2 in the air or 3 in the air as you play other flyers to pump it. So I actually think this could be the missing piece for the Bat deck in Standard. Whether or not Momo is enough to actually make Bats into, like, a legit tier deck, we're going to have to do some play testing to figure that out. But this is a very good Bat style card and a pretty cool design. We also got a new red flash enchantment in Faded Firepower. So a 3 and X enchantment that has flash. It says it enters with X fire counters on it, and if a source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus the amount of damage equal to the number of fire counters on this enchantment instead. So essentially, if you play this for 4 mana, it has 1 counter. All your stuff deals its normal damage plus 1. If you play it for 2 mana, it's got 2 counters. It's your damage plus 2. If you play this for 103 mana, it has 100 counters. All your stuff deals plus 100 damage. You probably win the game. So Faded Firepower, this card's very interesting. So it's not efficient, right? If you think about other effects that can add more damage to your stuff, like Mechanized Warfare for 3 mana is just plus 1 damage for your red stuff and artifact stuff. Torbrand plus 2 damage for 4 mana. Once you get up to like 6 mana, 8 mana, you get stuff like Fire Emancipation, City on Fire that just triples up your damage. So Faded Firepower, compared to these effects, it isn't especially efficient, but it has one massively huge upside that I think actually makes this card legit scary, and that is the fact that this has flash. So I think that why Wizards gave this flash is to make it work with the Firebending mechanic, and we're probably going to see some interesting cards in the Mardu colors that normally would only be playable at sorcery speed, end up with flash, end up as instants, just to make the Firebending mechanic actually work for limited and for standard. But the fact that you can flash this in is wild. So I think the intention is you're playing, you know, a Avatar draft, and you attack with your Foyer Lord Zurko, and then you use the mana from Firebending to flash this in and get a little extra damage out of it. That's fine, but it actually can do way more than that. So this card is super scary with VV. Not that it's actually going to get played in competitive VV decks, but imagine VV's ping ability dealing 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 every time he casts a non-creature spell instead of just 1. It's going to close out the game super fast. I think the best home for this is going to be in go wide style decks. So if you're playing a bunch of 1/1s, doubling or tripling their damage isn't that exciting, right? Your 1/1 doubles up to 2. That's still not that much damage. Faded Firepower in something like Krenko that is just going wide with a bunch of 1/1s actually offers a ton of damage. You cast this with even 2 or 3 or 4 counters, it's going to be better than a Fiery Emancipation in a lot of situations. And the fact that it has flash is just so mind-blowingly strong, because that means you can attack with your team and your opponent's not going to know that you have all this extra damage. Wait until after your opponent blocks and then flash this in to maybe kill your opponent on the spot. It also is cute with Proliferate. You can cast this with a low number of counters and then add more counters to it. Red isn't the most popular Proliferate color, but still, if you're playing Contagion class, Contagion engine, any Proliferate stuff, this goes up even more in value. But I think that this card might actually just be busted. It might actually just be better than Fiery Emancipation. This might actually be, if you squint hard enough, the red version of Craterhoof Behemoth. So hear me out with this. Hear me out with this. The fact that you can flash this in, if you think about something like Craterhoof Behemoth, it's 8 mana and it pumps your team a ton. Faded Firepower, if you cast this for 8 mana, it's going to be giving all of your team, in a weird way, +5/+5. It's dealing +5 damage compared to what it would deal before. And doing it instant speed just makes it so much scarier. And if you think about red decks in Commander in specific, a lot of them are doing 2 things, which one is they're doing damage shenanigans like Imodane or O'Hare Axelon. And in those decks, Faded Firepower is great. It's either like a backup for your O'Hare Axelon, it's offering more damage to your spells for your Imodane, or their go wide decks like Zada goes so wide. Perforos is all about going wide with a ton of these little bodies. In any deck like that, I think Faded Firepower might actually just legit be one of the best finishers for your deck. So I think Faded Firepower, it's probably going to be a little too clunky to actually be a competitive standard card. But in Commander, I think this card is actually going to be kind of a bomb, and I would not be surprised to see it murdering lots of people out of mono red decks. We also got a new saga that flips into a creature in the Rise of Sozin. So Rise of Sozin, 6 mana black saga. First lore counter, destroy all creatures. Second one, choose a card name, search target opponent's graveyard, hand, and library for up to 4 cards with that name, exile them, and they shuffle. Third lore counter flips into Fire Lord Sozin, a 5/5 legendary human noble, not an ally, with Menace and Firebending 3, so when it attacks, you make 3 red mana, and then when it deals combat damage to a player, you can pay X. When you do, put any number of target creature cards with total mana value X or less from that player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So the backside of this card, another cool design for taking advantage of Firebending. If you make a bunch of Firebending mana, you can dump it all into reanimating a bunch of stuff from your opponent's graveyard, although this is a card that I think a huge percentage of Commander players are going to play incorrectly. Because let me ask you, and no cheating, what is the color identity of this card? So one thing Commander players learn is if there's mana symbols on a card, it counts towards color identity. So at a glance, you see black mana symbols on the front, red ones on the back. It's a Rakdos card, right? Well, not exactly, because there's one exception to this rule, and that is if the mana symbols show up in reminder text, which those parentheses signify reminder text, then they don't count to color identity. We see this with Extort. I think that's the most infamous example of a mechanic where you have the mana symbols in the reminder text for Exort, which are Orzhov hybrid, but it shows up on mono black cards and mono white cards. But this card is actually just mono black by color identity. Those red mana symbols don't actually count, but I think a lot of people are going to see this as a Rakdos card because it isn't super intuitive how it works with the color identity rules. But this card in general, I think is actually pretty powerful. So it is 6 mana, which is a lot, but you get a Damnation into like a Lost Legacy, into like a weird Ink Eyes effect that's going to reanimate your opponent's stuff. It seems very good in some sort of control deck, right? Assuming it's not too slow. That is the biggest concern, is 6 mana, it might just be too slow. In some ways, speaking of too slow, it reminds me of Invasion of Fiora, another 6 mana Wrath, and this was a battle, right? So you Wrath for 6 mana, and then you defeat the battle, you flip into Marchesa, this big 6/3 that can draw you cards and do a bunch of stuff. The Rise of Sozin, I think, way better, since you don't have to send damage at it to defeat it like you would a battle, but still, 6 mana, it might be a little bit too slow, but I think the effect is pretty powerful. Like, imagine some sort of control deck where you just use this to Wrath the board, then you get rid of all your opponent's VVs or choose their best card, doesn't really matter, and then you get this 5/5 that can reanimate the stuff that you blew up with the first lore counter once it starts hitting your opponent. That actually seems like kind of a legit plan. I think the question's going to be, is it better than Deadly Cover-Up? So it's 1 more mana than Deadly Cover-Up. It has a better lobotomy style effect where you get to get rid of any card and not just a card in your opponent's graveyard, but you still have to wait another turn for that. So if you play this fairly, it's not going to be until turn 7 that you get rid of all the VVs or whatever card you choose with the second lore counter. And then you do get a good creature on the backside. I don't know. I think I really want to say this card's good and going to be good in standard, but I do have that fear in the back of my head that it's 6 mana. It might just be too expensive to actually see a bunch of competitive play, but it does do a lot. Like, if you just add together everything this card's doing, it actually is a very, very efficient card. It's just a little bit slow. I'm going to build a deck around this because I love the idea of just exiling all my opponent's threats. And this is another card alongside Deadly Cover-Up and Ancient Vendetta in the end that we can play in standard that just exiles all the copies of something from our opponent's deck. So definitely going to bring back some Mono Black Exile once we get to the Avatar set. The other problem with this card, and this is probably the biggest deal breaker at the moment for this being good, is if you play this as your Wrath, it's a Wrath that gets countered by a Null, and a Null is kind of everywhere right now because people are trying to stop Simulacrum Synthesizer, Agrath's Soul Cauldron. So the fact that this is going to get countered by one of the most popular sideboard cards when something like Deadly Cover-Up wouldn't get countered by a Null might mean that this card wouldn't be very good in the current meta. Although, remember, Avatar doesn't release until November or something, so by then, the meta might look way different than it does today. Where this card I think will shine is in Commander. In Commander, the second lore counter, obviously not super exciting, but the Wrath mode isn't that bad. Black is just oddly not that great at Wrathing. The best Wrath is Damnation, but once you get past Damnation, it's really expensive stuff like Decree of Pain and Garrick's Wake, and then like Crux of Fate, which is at its best in a Dragon deck. So a 6 mana Wrathing Commander in Mono Black actually is not that expensive because Black Wraths just tend to be more expensive. And then even though the second lore counter isn't going to do much in a Commander game, a 6 mana Wrath that turns into a pretty powerful creature that maybe you hasted up and reanimate some stuff actually seems fine. So I think I would at least try this card in Commander. Not saying it's better than Damnation or whatever. I don't think it's quite at that tier, but I do think it could be playable there. So the Rise of Sozin, it's just a super fun, flavorful card. I love the sagas that flip into creatures. It's such a fun design. We're going to build around it in standard. I could maybe be competitive in some sort of control deck in standard. Worst case, a solid Commander Wrath. Moving into the realm of lower rarity cards and some weird stuff. We got the basic lands from the set, which actually look pretty cool. I really love the Swamp, which looks like a forest to me because it's got a big tree in it, but the tree looks super cool, so I think I'm going to play with the Swamp, but really all the basics look pretty good. We also got 3 cards that are coming from Avatar Eternal. So Avatar Eternal is like a set that's adjacent to Avatar that's not standard legal. I think the cards mostly come in Jumpstart packs, which are also releasing alongside Avatar. So these cards, Cabbage Merchant, Katara Waterbending Master, Aang Airbending Master, they're Commander only cards essentially. I guess you could play them in Legacy or Vintage if you wanted to. So Tomer's going to do a video talking about these over on the Commander channel, digging into their Commander implications. So I'm not going to get into them here, but I did want to mention that they exist. We also found out that we're getting another special sheet. If you remember Final Fantasy, they had the Final Fantasy Through the Ages sheet, where they took actual like screen caps of iconic moments and put them onto reprints. They're doing the same thing with Avatar. We see Force Negation, we see the buy-in tree as the Great Henge, and these are super expensive reprints. Force Negation's like $50. This is notably the first time it's coming to Arena, which is going to be a really big deal for Timeless, which has really struggled with degenerate combo decks. The Great Henge like $70 because of commander purposes. So the cards look great. I love these special sheets, although I gotta do a little complaining. So when I think of special sheets in Magic, I think of Strixhaven Mystical Archives, Brother War Retro Artifacts, and the way that these worked is you got one in every pack. And yeah, some of them would suck because there's a bunch of commons and uncommons alongside the really good ones, but it was cool that in every single pack, you would get one of these cards from the special seat. So in Final Fantasy, I believe the numbers were in play boosters, one in every 3 packs, you would get one of the Through the Ages sheet, one in every collector booster, of course. But Wizards announced today during the stream that with Avatar, they are dropping the rate in these in play boosters significantly. Now the rate's going to be, you get one of these every 24 packs, which basically means on average, 1 per box. And if they're still doing a bunch of random commons and uncommons, and they're not all just like super valuable ones, odds are you're going to get a random uncommon that's worth like $1 anyway. So that change seems to make play boosters even worse to open. And Wizards on the stream, they were very quick to point out, well, you get one in every collector booster pack. So yes, if you buy the $700 booster box or $1,200 booster box instead of the $200 and hopefully even cheaper booster box, you can get one in every pack. But it is very disappointing to see them pulling back even further on putting the cool, inexpensive cards in the cheapest booster product. To me, it just comes across as kind of greedy, honestly, which is just not a great look at a time when Wizards is making literally record-breaking profits. Like, is it really going to hurt if some poor pleb gets to open a Force Negation in their play booster pack, Wizards? Like, I can't imagine that's going to tank your bottom line. So, little disappointed that they're cutting the rate so severely in play boosters, but at the same time, super hyped about Force Negation on Arena, and also the Great Henge, just a solid reprint. As far as lower rarity cards, we also found out that shrines are returning with Southern Air Temple. So this is a 4-mana white legendary shrine. It says when it enters, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, where X is the number of shrines you control. And when another shrine you control enters, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So Southern Air Temple actually is kind of notable when it comes to shrines. So if you think of shrines in Magic, they go back to original Kamigawa, and those were shrines that triggered on your upkeep. Then we got some in M21 that triggered the beginning of your pre-combat main phase. Then we got creature shrines in our return to Kamigawa that triggered end step, but discounting Goshen Tie of Life's Origins, which was a commander pre-con card, these are the first shrines, or this is the first shrine that actually is an enters trigger. And enters triggers are way more powerful than wait until your upkeep or wait until your end step triggers. So I think this is actually really powerful shrine. So if you're a shrine lover, keep an eye out for this. I wouldn't be surprised to see Goshen Tai kind of go up in price. People love playing with shrines, and people are going to be really excited to see a whole new set of shrines, which kind of seem power crept for 2025 with these enters trigger, rather than having you wait and you do the delayed gratification thing to actually get your value out of them. We also got maybe the funniest card in the set, in Sokka's Haiku, which is a 5-mana lesson. It's an instant. It says, counter target spell, draw a card, then mill 3 cards, untap target land. If you didn't notice the counting, it is literally an actual haiku on a card. So well done on that, Wizards. When I first read it, I didn't realize it was haiku. And I was like, that's a lot of just like weird words on a card. Why am I untapping 1 land, drawing 1 card, milling 3 cards? But then when I realized it's actually a haiku, that's actually pretty well done. Pretty well done on that one, Wizards. Finally, we get some draft chaff that you can check out over at MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our Avatar The Last Airbender spoilers. So let me know what you think. Now that we've got these super early spoilers, what's your hype level for this at? Is it going up? Is it going down? I gotta say, I think this set's going to be really good. I think the mechanics are really interesting, and I feel like the flavor actually fits pretty well in a world of Magic. Like, it's pretty fantasy, you got a bunch of weird creatures, so I think it's actually a really good fit, and I think this set's actually going to be pretty successful, and it already has some cards that I'm really excited to start playing with. But let me know what you think. What cards are you most hyped for? How hyped are you for Avatar? Avatar or Spider-Man? That's been a big debate at Goldfish recently. Which set is going to do better? I'm on Team Avatar, but I'm curious, which set do you think, when we look back on this a year from now, is Spider-Man or Avatar actually going to be the more popular, better selling set? Give me your guess in the comments, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks with some Spider-Man spoilers. Of course, Avatar, we don't go back into spoiler season till, I believe, the beginning of November, so this is our little early sneak taste, but we'll get some more in a couple of months. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon.